Okay, Professor Michaels, could you tell us briefly what is the main thesis of your book, the main thesis of your book, The Trouble with Diversity?
Yeah, the main, I mean, it arose out of just noticing two things. One is completely obvious, and that is in the U.S., but not just in the U.S., there's been over the last 30 to 40 years a tremendous rise in the interest in identity and a commitment to respecting other identities, to criticizing and getting rid of discrimination, all of which are good things. But that at the same time that there's been that commitment, there has been in the U.S. in a spectacular fashion, and in many other countries in not quite so spectacular but nonetheless a real fashion, a rise in economic inequality.
And have the two things something to do with each other?
The two things have a lot to do with each other, but the first thing would be to say is that the first thing they have to do with each other is that the one distracts people from the other. So that in the U.S., the fundamental notion of social justice has become increasingly the idea that you're living in a just society if your elites, that is the rich, come in many different colors, in all possible sexes and genders, and also with as many different religions as possible. So the idea is that what justifies the difference between the elite and everybody else is that the elite is as diverse as everybody else is. So there's a certain sense then in which the first thing diversity does is provide a kind of excuse for or justification of a kind of the increasing gap between the rich and the poor.
And for you, both are part of neoliberalism.
Yeah, both are crucially part of neoliberalism. That is to say, neoliberalism itself cannot function. I mean, neoliberalism requires, for example, lots of immigration, which is a current issue here and in the U.S. Why does liberalism require immigration? Because just as you want capital to be able to flow across borders in globalization, you want labor to be able to flow across borders. And you want it for exactly the same reason. That is, you want the cheapest possible competent labor. I mean, if you're a capitalist in the U.S., you don't care if that labor is gay or straight. You don't care if that labor is Mexican or Asian. You don't care if it's legal or illegal. You just want it to be able to do the job you need it to do. So you need to bring in people from everywhere. But once you get those people from everywhere, you need them to get along with each other. You need them to respect. You need them to respect each other while you're paying them minimum wage. And you need to be able to respect them while you're paying them minimum wage. And of course, the core of the issue of diversity is that it requires we respect each other. And as every capitalist recognizes right away, it's a lot cheaper for me to respect your identity than it is for me to pay you a living wage.
You wrote the book in 2006. Since then, a lot has happened. We have a new president in the US. And also we have surely the biggest financial crisis in 70, 80 years. And I have the impression now people talk more about inequality.
I think that is true. I would say in the U.S. there were two parts of that. First, we got the new president, and that was a testament to the triumph of diversity and of anti-discrimination. It was a shock, I think, even to people who write about this, that Obama got nominated and then got elected. But of course, the second part of that was he wasn't able to do much about the increase in inequality. And I think it is true. When I wrote that book, the subtitle of that book, this book is called The Trouble with Diversity, How We Learn to Love Identity and Ignore Inequality. And at that time, there were comparatively few people who were interested in inequality. Now, when Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez, who are two of the major economists working on this, when they post new data on their website, it's on the front page of the New York Times the same day. That is a difference. American political discourse, and not just American, but European political discourse has changed. Inequality is now back toward the center. However, doing something about that inequality is a whole different story, and so far Americans have shown no interest whatsoever, at least the political classes, in doing anything about it. Whether that'll be true in Europe or not remains to be seen.
Yeah. You mentioned Europe. I have the impression that in Europe, identity has become more important. Racism, xenophobic reactions, as compared to 20 years ago, and inequality is not so big as in the US.
Yeah, well, I think there's an important sense in which I would have said for sure until the Great Recession hit that a crucial thing is just that Europe is sort of, in this case, about 15 years behind the US. That is, one of the things I was really struck by in writing the book, and then there was a French edition of it, which came out about 2 years later, is that if you looked at inequality statistics in the US, you saw huge increases starting in the 1970s. Whereas when you looked at them in France, actually the really interesting increases didn't start until the mid-1990s, sort of 1997 to 2007, 2008, 2009. So in one sense, I think it really is because the US is a kind of, and I don't say this in a good way, it's not a good thing. The US is a more advanced neoliberal economy than Belgium is, than France is, than Germany is. The US and the UK are the sort of cutting edge of neoliberalism. And the other thing you would say is that as inequality increases, discussions of identity rise. It's almost like a mathematical theorem, right? That is, you can show that the increase in one produces an increase in the other. The more people actually have a gap between the rich and the poor, the more the political classes and intellectuals on both sides like to talk about racial differences and cultural differences.
Talk about, but not necessarily in a negative way, because in the US they talk about it, but they have seemed to, well, conquer racism.
Yeah, well, you can. Well, I would say that no one. It may look from the outside the U.S. has conquered racism, but I assure you that's not true. The U.S. has not conquered racism. I think that what both the left and the right like is for race and racism to be the problem. That is, as long as race is the problem, anti-racism is the solution. When economic inequality is the problem, redistribution is the solution. So I think that actually there's a certain way in which politicians from both sides benefit. Whether the racist version is obviously the bad version. The anti-racist version is, it seems to me, equally obviously the good version. But functionally, what they both do is move people away from what is, in the long run, the fundamental problem, and that is, in my view, the problem of class, not the problem of race or culture.
Last question, why is there such a hesitation or to touch or to do something about redistribution?
I think there are a couple of reasons. One is that I think it's genuinely the case that politicians are not clear what to do because we have for so long operated in a world in which markets seem both natural and inevitable. That actually beginning to, so you have a socialist elected in France who's just as committed to the market as his opponent was. He's committed to a different relation to that market. So there's a certain sense in which I think people generally don't know what to do. And I think economic crises are obviously bad things, and not just millions, but hundreds of millions of people are suffering in this current crisis. But there are also at least intellectual opportunities. And the intellectual opportunity here is to see that the fantasy that we could one day create a capitalism which would work for everybody is just that, a fantasy. And the job of the left now is to begin to think about exploiting that moment of insight and beginning to produce a vision of a new economy which would not be as driven by the market as ours currently is.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.